He knew how to recognize spin. He knew because he used to do it himself. He'd learned every technique for controlling interviews, redirecting questions, staying on message when the message was uncomfortable. From the first answer, something was off. George had built those structures himself, decades ago. He recognized them like an architect recognizes another's blueprint. Then he asked one question. Simple, direct. The kind of question he'd asked hundreds of times. What Meghan said made George pause. What George said after that, drawing on everything he'd learned about spin from both sides of the camera, would be discussed for weeks. This is the interview that revealed everything. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and let's see what happened. The interview location had been carefully chosen. A neutral Manhattan living room, styled to feel like someone's home without belonging to anyone. ABC's special format for intimate conversations required this kind of setting. George Stephanopoulos had conducted hundreds of these deep-dive interviews over his legendary career, from presidents in crisis to billionaires facing collapse. Meghan arrived with an entourage that seemed excessive for an intimate interview. Publicist, handler, someone whose job appeared to be monitoring energy levels. She walked into the space with practiced grace, shook George's hand warmly, settled into the interview chair with careful attention to lighting and angles. Meghan, thank you for sitting down with me. George, I've always admired your work. My work involves asking difficult questions and expecting real answers. Let's see if we can have that kind of conversation. The recording began. I want to start with something fundamental, George said, his voice carrying the measured calm that had interviewed world leaders. Your brand, the public persona you've built since leaving the royal family. How would you describe it in your own words? Meghan's smile was present but calculated. I'm an advocate, a storyteller, a mother finding her voice. Finding your voice. That phrase appears frequently in your interviews. But I'm curious. After years of public speaking, documentaries, podcasts, magazine features, how much more finding is required? It's an ongoing journey. Is it? Or is the finding framing strategic? Because from outside, your voice seems quite found. You've used it extensively. The Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, the book. At what point does finding become using? Meghan shifted slightly. I'm evolving. We all evolve. But evolution implies change. What's changed in your message over the past 5 years? Because the themes seem consistent. Institutional mistreatment, media persecution, seeking authenticity. The message hasn't evolved, it's been repeated. Netflix, George said, shifting terrain. The reports have been extensive. The As Ever brand dropped. With Love, Meghan ended after 2 seasons. Sources saying the mood at Netflix is, we're done. What happened? Creative partnerships evolve in different directions. That's corporate language. I used to write corporate language for a living. It means someone's unhappy. Who's unhappy and why? Meghan's expression tightened. Our relationship with Netflix has been productive. Has been. Past tense. The Variety report used specific language. Unsold products being given to employees. Uncertainty about future projects. That doesn't sound productive. That sounds like termination. Every partnership faces challenges. Not every partnership gets described as, we're done, by internal sources. That's specific. That's final. What went wrong? Creative differences. Creative differences about what? Because the reports suggest the differences were about output, about delivery, about whether the partnership was producing value. Were those the differences? Silence stretched uncomfortably. Spotify, George continued. That partnership ended differently. An executive reportedly called you, I'll use a polite paraphrase, grifters. That's extraordinary language for a business partner. What happened there? Meghan's face had gone red. That characterization was unfair and inaccurate. Was it? The partnership produced 1 podcast season after a $20 million deal. That's significant investment for limited output. What was the obstacle? We had different visions for the content, different visions that resulted in almost no content. When someone pays $20 million and receives one podcast season, frustration is understandable. The grifter language suggests they felt deceived. Did they have reason to feel deceived? I delivered what was agreed. Did you? Because the timeline suggests otherwise. Years of development, minimal output, then termination. That's not creative differences, that's failure to deliver. Meghan grabbed her water. Her hand was trembling. Let me tell you something about my background, George said, leaning back with the ease of someone who'd been through far more difficult conversations. Before journalism, I was Bill Clinton's communications director. I crafted narratives for a living. I managed crises. I learned every technique for staying on message when the message was uncomfortable. He looked at her directly. I recognize those techniques. I recognize them in this conversation. Every answer you've given has been constructed. Every response has been designed to redirect rather than inform. You're not answering questions. You're managing a conversation. I used to do that. I know what it looks like. I've been honest. You've been strategic. Those aren't the same things. Honest would be telling me what went wrong with Netflix. Honest would be explaining why Spotify executives feel deceived. Honest would be acknowledging that your media partnerships have largely failed. You've done none of that. I won't accept your characterization. You won't accept accountability. That's different. My characterizations are based on documented reports. Your denials are based on preference. One is journalism. The other is spin. Archwell, George said. Your foundation. I've covered nonprofits for decades. The effective ones can describe their impact specifically. What has Archwell accomplished? We've built meaningful partnerships across sectors. That's mission language. I'm asking about outcomes. What's different in the world because Archwell exists? Who's been helped? What's changed? We focus on systemic change. Systemic change you can't describe. I've interviewed charity leaders. They talk about schools built, policies changed, lives transformed. They can't stop talking about it because they're proud of concrete results. You can't access any of that. Why? Our approach is long-term. Long-term without short-term evidence. That's what everyone says when nothing's happening. After years of operation, surely something measurable exists? Our impact isn't captured in traditional metrics. George leaned forward. Impact that isn't captured isn't impact. It's intention. And intention without outcome is just aspiration with a tax status. The staff departures, George continued. Multiple communications directors, high turnover across the organization, reports of difficult working conditions. What's happening internally? Every organization faces transitions. At your rate? I've covered organizational dynamics extensively. This level of turnover suggests systemic problems. What are they? I won't discuss internal matters publicly. You've discussed family internal matters publicly. You've published books about private conversations. You've done documentaries exposing intimate moments. The internal matters principle seems selective. That was different. Different how? You share when sharing serves your narrative. You claim privacy when questions get uncomfortable. That's not principle, that's convenience. Meghan stood up partially. You're being hostile. I'm being thorough. There's a difference. Hostile would be insulting you. What I'm doing is asking questions based on documented reports and expecting actual answers. If actual answers feel hostile, examine the gap between your public claims and your private reality. I want to try something, George said, his voice shifting to something more personal. A different kind of question. What's something you failed at? Something you look back on and think, I got that wrong. That was my mistake. Not the institution's fault. Not the media's fault. Mine. Silence stretched devastatingly. The silence is instructive. I've asked that question to presidents, CEOs, world leaders. Most of them can access their failures. They've reflected. They've learned. The fact that you can't access a single mistake after years of public difficulty suggests something important about your relationship with self-reflection. I've reflected extensively on others' failures, on institutional problems, on external obstacles. What about your own contribution? What did you do wrong? More silence. I've been in rooms with politicians in crisis. Even the most defended ones can eventually acknowledge their role. You can't. Or won't. Which is it? Meghan grabbed her purse. This interview is becoming an interrogation. George remained seated, completely calm. This interview is becoming journalism. The same journalism I've practiced for 30 years. The same questions I'd ask anyone in your position. The difference is, you're not used to them. You're used to friendly interviewers who accept your framing, who don't ask follow-ups, who treat your narrative as fact. My narrative is my truth. Your narrative is your construction. I used to build narratives for politicians. I know how they work. They select, they frame, they position. They're designed to control perception rather than convey reality. Your narrative is masterfully constructed. But construction isn't truth. You don't know what I've experienced. I know what you've presented. And what you've presented is carefully managed. Every interview, every documentary, every public appearance. The consistency isn't authenticity, it's discipline. And discipline in service of narrative is spin. I recognize it because I used to do it. Meghan moved toward the exit. You've joined everyone who wants to tear me down. George stood now, his presence commanding the space. I've joined journalism, which you've apparently learned to experience as attack. But asking what your foundation has accomplished isn't attack. Asking why your partnerships failed isn't attack. Asking you to name a single mistake isn't attack. Those are questions. The attack you're experiencing is simply accountability, the thing everyone in public life faces. I've faced more scrutiny than presidents I've interviewed, than CEOs watching their companies collapse, than politicians in the middle of scandals. I've sat with all of them. Most of them eventually engage honestly. You haven't. You've deflected every question. You've blamed external factors for every difficulty. You've positioned yourself as victim of circumstances rather than participant in outcomes. Meghan paused at the door. History will judge. History judges outcomes. What are yours? Not your intentions, not your aspirations, not your carefully constructed narrative. What actually exists because of your work? What's changed? Who's better off? Silence answered. That's what I thought. I've done this for 30 years. I've interviewed people at the height of their power and the depth of their failure. The ones who succeed, who actually make a difference, can point to results. You can't. And the inability to point to results while claiming to be an advocate, that's the gap that matters. Meghan left. The studio door closed behind her. George turned to face the camera. I want to explain what just occurred, because it matters. He settled back into his chair with the composure of someone who'd done this thousands of times. I've been a journalist for 30 years. Before that, I was a political operative. I've seen narrative construction from both sides. I've done it, and I've questioned it. What I experienced today was sophisticated narrative construction meeting basic journalism. And the construction couldn't survive the journalism. He paused. Every question about her partnerships got deflected. Every question about her foundation got generalities. Every question about her own mistakes got silence. The architecture of her public persona is impressive. But architecture without foundation collapses when examined. He straightened. I know spin because I used to spin. I recognize deflection because I used to deflect. What I saw today was someone so committed to narrative that narrative has become identity. And when narrative becomes identity, questions become existential threats. That's why she left. Not because I was hostile. Because genuine engagement would require acknowledging the gap between construction and reality. Here's what concerns me, George continued. She has enormous platform, enormous visibility, enormous opportunity to actually accomplish things. Instead, that platform gets used for what? maintaining narrative, defending construction, processing grievance. The actual outcomes, the measurable changes she could create, don't seem to exist. He looked at the camera. I've interviewed world leaders who've changed history. They can describe what they built. CEOs who've created companies. They can name what exists because of them. Advocates who've changed policy. They can point to legislation. She can point to nothing. After years, after millions spent, after countless interviews, nothing concrete. He paused. That's not attack. That's observation. And observation that feels like attack reveals the fragility of what's being observed. He straightened his jacket. When we come back, we'll discuss someone who can actually describe their impact, because that contrast matters. Platform without outcome is just visibility. Advocacy without result is just performance. And performance, however sophisticated, isn't substance. The footage aired that evening. ABC made no edits. The clips that spread captured the unprecedented moment. I recognize those techniques. I used to do that. I know what it looks like. You're not answering questions. You're managing a conversation. Impact that isn't captured isn't impact. It's intention. I've asked that question to presidents. Most of them can access their failures. You can't. The attack you're experiencing is simply accountability. I know spin because I used to spin. Meghan's team released a statement calling the interview a predetermined attack by someone whose political background has made him incapable of fair journalism. George addressed it the following morning on GMA. Political background? Yes, I worked in politics. That's why I recognize political techniques. Every answer she gave was crafted, positioned, designed to redirect. I know because I used to craft those answers. The fairness she's questioning is simply asking questions and expecting answers. She couldn't provide any, he added. I've interviewed presidents facing impeachment who engaged more honestly. CEOs watching billions evaporate who took more responsibility. The inability to name a single personal mistake, a single concrete accomplishment, a single thing that exists because of her work. That's not my failure to be fair. That's her failure to be real. For George Stephanopoulos, the interview became an unexpected demonstration of what happens when political expertise meets political performance. Proof that 3 decades of journalism, combined with political experience, could recognize construction that others missed. For Meghan Markle, it was catastrophic. George wasn't tabloid media. He wasn't entertainment journalism. He was George Stephanopoulos, someone who'd worked at the highest levels of political communication, who knew how narrative was constructed because he'd constructed it himself. Being exposed by someone with that expertise revealed something no media strategy could address. But for the millions who watched, something else emerged. The contrast between George's experience, 3 decades of interviews, political background, understanding of spin, and Meghan's complete inability to answer basic questions, told its own story. George had asked about accomplishments. Meghan provided generalities. George had asked about failures. Meghan provided silence. George had asked for anything real. Meghan left. And in that leaving, in that devastating inability to engage with someone who could recognize exactly what she was doing, everything anyone needed to know about the gap between Meghan Markle's construction and Meghan Markle's reality became impossible to ignore. Some people build things that survive examination. Others construct narratives that collapse under questions. George knew the difference because he'd done both. Meghan couldn't hide because George could see. That's the whole story. 30 years of journalism.